So why Elon Musk? When Lawrence reached out to me and asked me if I had a program, I wish I'd have looked at the calendar because I'd have done it on the state address. It should have been much more interesting discussed. But given that, at the time, I told her, how about Elon Musk? Because he's constantly in the news, he's very controversial. And at the end of 2023, he was listed as the wealthiest person in the world. Forbes listed his wealth at $244 billion. And many of us don't know where did he get that money. You know, we associate maybe Tesla, maybe SpaceX, but there's more to that story. So I want to try and be objective and talk about how he grew up, how he developed, and how he got to where he is today. But before I do that, why am I so interested in Elon Musk? Back when I graduated from college, went back to get my business degree. The leadership model that was taught in business school at that time was Frederick Taylor, scientific management. And that was what was in place on how you ran a business, how you treated employees, how you made decisions, and it was scientific management. And then along came guys like Robert Townsend and let's see who else, Tom Peters. And Tom Peters came out with a book called In Search of Excellence, and he tried to describe what makes successful companies successful. And it's an overwhelming popular book, and it became kind of the mantra of leadership, to try to emulate those leaders, whether it's Jack Smith at GE, that were really successful and grew their companies. And Robert Townsend, he put out this book called Up the Organization, which was kind of a diatribe against scientific management. And I was young and like a sponge trying to learn all this stuff so that I could have a successful career. Ken Blanchard came out with a book called The 1 Minute Manager. But the most important book in 1989 was a guy by the name of, many have probably heard of this, Stephen Covey, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Very, very popular book, endorsed by everybody in the management field, all these business leaders, congressmen, sports leaders, and it became kind of a model for a personal growth as a leader. And so that kind of set me on my journey to kind of understand successful people. And so it started with Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Edison, Andrew Carnegie, J.D. Rockefeller, Henry Ford, who I really admire as a business leader. And then I moved on to the modern group of people, Walt Disney, Thomas Edison, Andrew Carnegie, J.D. Rockefeller, and modern people like Mark Zuckerberg, who created Facebook, and Warren Buffett, the financial wizard, and Steve Jobs, who created Apple, and Bill Gates from Microsoft, and Jeff Bezos from Amazon, and of course, Elon Musk. You cannot ignore that Elon Musk, who's been nominated 4 times by the Time magazine in the last 8 years as the most influential person in the world. And then in 2021, they finally named him Person of the Year. So that kind of drew me to Elon Musk because I didn't know much about him. All I knew was this is a guy that was associated with Tesla. And I knew nothing about Tesla because we don't have any Teslas in northern Michigan. We don't have a dealership. In fact, up until a couple of months ago, we only had one plug-in for an electrical car, and it was here at the college. And if you were a visitor and you had an electric car and you needed to be charged, you had to call up the maintenance guy, who is now our CFO, and have him come and unlock it so that you could charge your vehicle. So for me, it was a journey of trying to figure out who Elon Musk was, particularly very popular media like Time magazine said he's the most influential person in the last 50 years. After I did a lot of research, a lot of reading, and I kind of agree. He probably is one of the most influential people of the modern era. So let's talk a little about. I just going to give you a factual update here. This is kind of off of Wikipedia. So Elon Musk was born on June 28, 1971. He's a businessman and an investor. He's founder and chairman, CEO and chief technology officer of SpaceX. He's and an angel investor, a CEO and product architect, and former chairman of Tesla and the biggest stockholder in Tesla. He's the owner and chairman of and chief technology officer of X Corporation, founder of The Boring Company and X Artificial Intelligence. He's co-founder of Neuralink and OpenAI, president of the Musk Foundation. Again, he's the wealthiest person in the world as rated by Forbes. At the end of 2023, his net worth was worth $244 billion. It's estimated that by the end of 2024, he probably will be one of the first trillionaires. So he grew up in Pretoria, and I have an interesting story about Pretoria in South Africa. Here 2 years ago during the pandemic, I had a family show up at the Anyway office and said, hey, I understand you guys have free coats and winter boots. I said, yes, I do. And I noticed a strong accent. I asked him where they're from. He says, we're from South Africa. We're moving to Australia. And we're living right now with my wife's father, who owns the Big Bear Lodge. And we're stuck here. We have two adult children, with teenage children. And he said, Australia closed their borders, and we're stuck here. I can't get a green card. I can't do anything. I have to wait until Australia opens their borders and allows them, because they recruited us to come to Australia and work. She is a world-class athlete, and he had a master's degree, and he did some work here in Alpena, some consulting work, even though he didn't have a green card. You might have heard of him. His name is Reinold Schultz, and his wife Talitha. And so I asked him, what brings you from South Africa to Alpena? And he told me the story. And I said, why are you leaving South Africa? And he says, violence. It's a horrible place to live. He said, in Pretoria, my wife wanted to go out and run outside. I'd have to have an armed guard with her, or she'd get robbed and beaten, and so forth. It is a terrible environment to raise my children. And so that piqued my interest because I knew Elon Musk grew up in Pretoria. So much of his background on how he treats people and his personality is based on this environment that existed as he was growing up in Pretoria. His family was anti-apartheid. His dad moved to a reserve outside of Pretoria and raised the family. His mother and father were divorced at his age of 8, and he basically went and lived with his father, and which he immensely regrets. So he had a horrible childhood, terrible childhood. He was bullied, and his father sent him on these things called School, which is a wilderness training camp for kids. They bus you out into the wilderness, and it's kind of like, somebody put it, it's a bit like a parliamentary Lord of the Flies. The older kids tormented and beat up the young kids, stole their provisions, and that was acceptable. Strong survived. And so when he was young at 12, he had to go through this School experience. He got humiliated, beaten, and his dad called him a weakling, and put him down immensely, and told him that, he was worthless. And this went on and on, not just from School, but everything else. In regular school, he was beaten by his peers. He was terribly bullied. And actually, at one point, he was beaten so bad he had to be hospitalized, thrown down a concrete stairway. And his dad chastised him as being weak and stupid. And his brother collaborates and said, yeah, Dad, stood there for an hour and told him how stupid he was, how weak he was, how poor he was, what a disgrace he was. And he said, all Elon could do is stand there and stare at him. So that's the kind of childhood upbringing Elon had. He regrets having lived with his father. His mother was kinder and nicer, probably more doting. And as he became successful, his mother actually moved to be near him when he was in LA forming SpaceX. So anyway, back to a little bit more of his facts.
Okay? He grew up in Pretoria, but when he turned 18, he wanted to get citizenship in the United States, but he couldn't. His mother was a Canadian, and so he ended up going to Canada. And in Canada, he attended Queensland University in Kingston. And then he later transferred to the University of Pennsylvania, which is the Ivy League school. And he received a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in economics and engineering and physics. He moved to California in 1995 to attend Stanford. He enrolled and was accepted. And just prior to his acceptance, he put it on hold because he and his brother started a company that started his road to financial success, something called Zip2, and we'll talk a little bit about that. It eventually led to his developing a thing called XCOM, which was the first online bank. And then he merged with a company called Cofinity to form this company called PayPal. And PayPal is where he got his huge financial start. PayPal was acquired by eBay in for $1.5 billion in 2002, with his share being over $100 million as the part owner of the company that got acquired by PayPal. He was an early investor in the electric vehicle, which eventually became Tesla. He was the CEO. He got thrown out as the CEO. He was the certified technology officer. He got alleviated that. Now he's just on the board and he's an advisor. But he is also the chief shareholder in Tesla. He owns like 13.5%. It's a $1 trillion market value company. Only the sixth company ever to have a market valuation of $1 trillion. So you take 13%, that's worthy of a $130 billion for $1 trillion market value company. That's what his Tesla shares of stock. If you read the news today, he's demanding the Tesla board, because he does draw a salary from Tesla. He wants his shares increased from 13.5% to 25%, because he wants to be total control and he doesn't want any other shareholder to have greater control that can bring in a board that he wouldn't like. So he's still very controversial, but he's also very perceptive from a business standpoint. On top of Tesla, he helped create a company called Solar City, which was put together by a couple of cousins that installed rooftop solar panels. Tesla, when he was the CEO of Tesla, ended up buying it, Solar City, and Solar City became one of the biggest residential solar installers in the country. It still is owned by Tesla. He opened and co-founded the company OpenAI, Artificial Intelligence, and it was a nonprofit artificial intelligence research company. And the following year, he co-founded a company called Neuralink. And if you watched 60 Minutes about 2 weeks ago, you would have seen a story about these quadriplegics who they're inserting brain fibers into their brain, into the areas that control their movement, and they're actually now being able to start to move, to overcome this disability, and that's what Neuralink's about. They put in your brain neuron fiber material to stimulate those areas of your brain that need assistance. So Neuralink is looking in the vision. He founded that company. It's a brain-computer interface. He also started the Boring Company, which is a tunnel boring company, because he had a vision of transportation. This is a true story. He was in Hong Kong at a seminar, and one of his coworkers found him on the balcony of the hotel, and he was looking out in space, just staring. And his partner came up to him and said, "Are you okay?" And he said, cities are 3-dimensional, roads are 2-dimensional. He got on the phone. He called SpaceLink, one of his people at SpaceLink, of materials procure. He says, "How much does a tunnel machine cost?" And he said, "I'll call you back in 3 hours. Please find out." 3 hours later, he called back. The guy said, 50 million. He said, buy 2 of them. And he started the boring company with these 2 tunnel boring machines. His intent was to bore tunnels from cities like Washington to New York and put people in electromagnetic pods, and they could travel at supersonic speed between these cities. Okay, so more on that later. But he's a thinker, so that didn't really fly. So his idea was then he created this tunnel system at the SpaceX headquarters in California, a 1-mile experimental tube. And so he opened a competition to students all over the world to design pods that would work in this vacuum, created tubes like the bank vacuum things, and move the people on an electromagnetic conveyor at supersonic speeds. But he was looking for pod designs. And so these are the kinds of things that run through Elon's brains. And of course, the latest acquisition was that he acquired Twitter. He cashed in a bunch of his stock in Tesla, and he bought Twitter. And that's where a lot of the recent controversy has come, because of his ownership of Twitter and what he has done with Twitter since he bought it up until today. So that's just a little biographic sum. Let's talk a little bit more about who he really is. Anybody here familiar with Asperger's syndrome? Okay. They don't call it Asperger's syndrome anymore because it was based on a Vienna doctor, Hans Asperger, who during the Nazis' reign in Austria in the 1940s, he tried to set aside this syndrome as a high-functioning syndrome so that those kids that he was studying and developing wouldn't get murdered and their parents wouldn't be so treated by the Nazis, sterilization. As you know, the Nazis had a program that if you had defective children, the defective children were murdered or sent to the gas chambers, and the parents were sterilized. And Dr. Asperger, most of the research on Asperger's disease is done on all of his research and study, and they now kind of, they moved away from it and now refer to it as the higher end of form of autism. So let's talk a little bit about the effects of Asperger's. You can't relate to people or society. You act very awkward in social settings. You have trouble making eye contact. You miss social cues that other people find obvious. You struggle to read body language. You don't understand what facial expressions mean. You show few emotions. You speak in a flat, robotic tone. You don't change your tone quality of your voice. And you talk a lot about one topic. Okay? Very focused. It could be statistics. It could be rocks and stones and minerals, but you focus on one topic. And you repeat words and certain movements and certain phrases, and you dislike change. And you stick to a very specific routine schedule and habits. And you have a very narrow set of self-interest, and you act in very repetitive ways. Some of the plus, you have very strong verbal skills. You become obsessed with a topic and learn everything possible about the topic, but you're hypersensitive and you have extreme social difficulties. That defines Elon Musk. He has Asperger's disease syndrome. He admits it. You know, on 60-Minute interview, he admits it. On Saturday Night Live, he admits it. There's a famous quote I love from him on Saturday Night Live during his monologue. He said, "To anyone I've offended, I just want to say, I reinvented electric cars and I'm sending people to Mars in a rocket ship. Do you think I was going to be a chill, normal dude?" That's Elon Musk. He doesn't think before he speaks what he's thinking without any filter. And so that's got him into a lot of trouble. But he is an extremely creative, inventive, visionary person with an enormous brain capacity. Some of his peers that have worked with him said, I think if you pulled his shirt up, you wouldn't see his belly button because he's from another planet. That's just some of the stuff. So growing up, I told you he had a tough childhood. He was even at one time, they had German Shepherds when they lived in Pretoria, and they would keep away visitors. German Shepherds liked the family, but very protective. He ran out the door one day and German Shepherd attacked him and bit him, and he had to go to the hospital. The only thing he said, please don't hurt the dog. Please don't hurt the dog. His dad killed the dog. I mean, so that's the kind of childhood. And his dad called him retarded. He had no friends in school. He didn't have spectacular grades. He wasn't one of these excelling extraordinary students. He had fairly average grades, very smart in math, but he was a voracious reader. His dad had 2 sets of encyclopedias. He read them both. He would go to whatever library, take all the technology books he could find and read them. And by the time he was 10, he had read these 2 sets of encyclopedias. When he was 12 years old, he had an existential crisis. Think about this. 12 years old, he couldn't figure out, why am I here? What am I about? What am I doing? Why is the universe here? He went into a severe depression because he couldn't understand those fundamental questions. And he felt that he wanted to develop benefits that protected humanity and develop intentions to protect and increase humanity and human consciousness. 12 years old. He began reading Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, where the heroes develop plans to send settlers to distant regions of the galaxy to preserve human consciousness. But mostly he came upon a little book called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, written by Doug Adams. And that book, as he will say and tell you, relieved him of his existential crisis he was going through. In the book, there's a story about, in the Hitchhiker's Guide, they developed this supercomputer. And so they enter this question to this supercomputer. What is the secret of the universe and why are we here? And the computer answers 42. Right? And the people were dumbfounded. He said, what do you mean 42? And he said, we don't know what the question is. The universe is the answer, not the question. That has shaped Elon Musk's thought process, philosophically and emotionally. We're not asking the right question. The universe, why we're here, that's the answer. The question is, how do we perpetuate our existence? He believes, number one, he has 3 things that he believes in. Number one, he believes that in order for human consciousness to exist into the future, we have to live interplanetary. He says, we live on a planet that can be destroyed in one quick instant. Nuclear war, an asteroid, or a pandemic. I said, and human consciousness evaporates and is gone from history. So he is focused and believes that the only way that human consciousness will exist, he said, he read a bunch of other science fiction books that said, what if we're it? What if there is no other intelligence out there? What if we're it? How do we preserve human consciousness? So his idea of colonizing Mars is his way of saying this is the only way for human consciousness to exist into the future. Interplanetary life. We can't just exist on this one planet. We need to have So that started him with SpaceX and why he wanted to colonize Mars. And when he jokingly says, hey, I'm trying to put people a rocket ship on Mars, that's not a joke. That's a real goal that he has, is Mars colonization. He's deathly afraid of artificial intelligence, even though he started OpenAI, a nonprofit, but his idea was to protect artificial intelligence from taking over humans. Any of you, 2001 Space Odyssey movie, if you've ever seen it, with the computer Hal, and Hal takes over, and the guy shuts Hal off because Hal has become smarter than the humans and wants to take over the humans, take over the spaceship. That was kind of visionary for Elon. He saw that we could create artificial intelligence that would master humans, and humans would become like pets. And so his plan was to prevent that from happening, to use artificial intelligence as a positive force, not something where they can take on our will and make decisions for us. So that was, and then climate change. That's his third concern. He said that is hugely, and he says, I'm the only person in the world that's really doing anything to address climate change, electric cars. And I put all my own money into electric cars, to design and build electric cars so that we get rid of fossil fuel. You can't hold the fault against him in that aspect. So growing up, he built his first computer when he was 11 years old, and he created a video game called Blaystar. And he did it using just 123 lines of basic code. And he ended up selling it for $500 to PC and Office Technology magazine, who then put it online and made it available. He was only 11 years old. So obviously his interests at that age about math and computer codes and technology and engineering were far more well-developed than his peers. It said in 1989, he moved to Canada. And when he moved to Canada, for 1 year, he visited some of his relatives. He ended up in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, where a cousin worked on a farm. And so he farmed. He helped farm. He physical labor. He took a job. He was looking for another job, and he took a job in Vancouver working in a lumber mill. And all the jobs were being paid $8 or $9 an hour, except for one job, $20 an hour. And that was putting on a hazmat suit and going in and cleaning the boilers, which he said $20 an hour is better than $9. And so he's not adverse to hard work and physical work. And then he bought a Greyhound bus pass when he was in Vancouver, a 6-month bus pass that allowed him to travel on Greyhound anywhere in Canada. And so he traveled back to Toronto. His younger brother moved to Toronto. And his mother, May, and his sister, Tosca, also joined them in Toronto. So the family all was living in Toronto. And while he was in Toronto, he interned for Microsoft. And when his brother arrived, they agreed that they were going to enroll in Queen's College in Kingston, Ontario. Why Queen's? They had a better social life. Elon really felt that he already knew as much as any of the engineering professors at the two colleges he was considered. And so they wanted to pick a college that had more girls and better social life. And that was why he went to Queen's. Okay? So when he was at Queen's, though, he did meet a guy by the name of Naveed Farooq, who was Indian or Pakistani, and they became immersed in these strategy games. Civilization, the Battle of Polytopia, Warcraft, Orcs and Humans, and Dungeons and Dragons. And that is how Elon today still relieves all of his stress. Marathon, intense sessions of these strategy games where you have so many limited choices to make, and the idea is to destroy your opponents. And as all the people that play with him will tell you, he always wins because he's so intense. And he's a risk taker. Where nobody else takes risk, Elon will always take the risk.
Did his father die just before he went to Canada?
His father's still alive. Errol. He's still alive. He's still alive, and the question was, is his father still alive? Yes, he is. And his father went back to South Africa, came and lived here for a while when he was in LA, but they didn't get along. Elon bought him a house in LA, didn't work out, and he was married. Errol remarried some other lady, and then he ended up impregnating his stepdaughter. And they now live together and have children, and he's still alive in South Africa. Yeah, it's you can't make up their family history. You really can't. So anyway, he was at Kingston, and he went to work for an outfit called Scotiabank, which is a very, very large Canadian bank. And he met a guy by the name of Peter Nicholson, who was one of their chief investment officers. And during that time, there were these things called Latin America bonds. And the Secretary of the United States Treasury, James Brady, was trying to prop up these Latin countries that were highly in debt. So they issued what they used to call Brady bonds. They were guaranteed by the United States government. And they were selling at 20% on the dollar of what they were guaranteed for. And Elon went to Peter and said, we need to buy these bonds. They're guaranteed an 80% increase if they fail. And Nicholson said, no, we already have enough Latin American debt. We're not going to do this. And so that led to Elon's thinking about banking, the evolution of PayPal, and his starting the first internet bank. So then he transferred to the University of Pennsylvania. He was given a scholarship, and in 1992 was when he transferred in his junior year, engineering and business. And he focused on 3 areas when he was there. He wanted to calibrate the force of gravity, and he analyzed the properties of materials and how the laws of physics applied to building rockets and Mars, and he concentrated on electric cars. And so those 3 areas of his focus while he was at the University of Penn helped him to lead to writing his senior thesis, The Importance of Being Solar, and the development of batteries and the importance of solar power. He got an A, and the instructors that reviewed it said, this is visionary, but we're just not ready. The materials, but he was already understanding the materials like lithium that could be used in long storage batteries. So in 1994, after he graduated, he transferred out to Silicon Valley. He enrolled in Stanford. He was going to pursue his PhD, but at the same time was the internet wave, 1994. All these .coms were starting to make huge money, and so he deferred his acceptance. And he and his brother created a company called Zip2. And Zip2 was pretty simple. It was a software program that gave you a map of the city and mailing addresses. And their biggest clients were newspapers. They sold it to 140 newspapers, Chicago Tribune, the New York Post, the New York Daily, the New York News, Washington Post. So they subscribed to it at a cost of $1,000 to $10,000 a month to utilize this software instead of a phone book. And they had pitched this idea way back when he was at Scotiabank. And the guy that they pitched it to grabbed the big, thick phone book and threw it at him and said, you're not going to replace that. You're never going to replace that. Later on, Scotiabank became a client. And he said, you were right, I was wrong. So this led them to his work ethic. He didn't sleep. He slept under his desk. He worked 18 to 20 hours a day, sleep 2 or 3 hours a day, no vacations, no time off, work, work, work. Because remember, they had to code all of that information and put all that data into the software before they could sell it. And so every time they did a newspaper, they had to go to a new city, get all the data, and code it and get it into their software. He and his brother constantly had regular fights, floor fights, fist fights, rolling fights, wrestling fights when they had a disagreement because of Elon's intense nature and Kimball always wanting to stand up against his brother. In 1999, this was about 3 years later, they sold K2 to Compaq Computer for $307 million in cash. And Elon's share was 22 million. And Kimball's, his younger brother, was 15 million. So that allowed him to create this new enterprise called XCOM. And XCOM was the first internet bank. And he thought that if I could create this internet bank to do all these financial transactions, my biggest customer would probably be eBay, because eBay's selling everything online. They could handle all these financial transactions online. But I also want to do loans. I want to do all this other stuff online as a commercial bank. He says, because then I would be $1 trillion institution, because I have all the control of all these financials. Their biggest competitor at the time was a small company called PayPal. And PayPal did the same thing and competed. It was financial transactions. Elon didn't want to be a niche company and only do just financial transactions. He wanted something bigger. He wanted to be a commercial online bank. Well, their major shareholders at the time, or stockholders at the time, thought that he was immature. He didn't have enough banking background. So they discharged him as CEO, and they brought in Bill Harris, who was the former head of Intuit, to run the company. Well, shortly thereafter, XCOM merged with PayPal. And then when they merged, there was this guy called Peter Thiel and Max Levchin, two guys that created PayPal. They had to work together because Elon was still the CEO of the merged company. And just to give you an idea of Elon's no risk, he had bought the fastest car in the world, the McLaren. And so when he met Peter Thiel, he brought him to his home in California. And so he's showing him this McLaren. And Thiel says, how fast will it go? Well, let me show you. So they took off in the car, he hit something and disintegrated. And neither one of them got hurt. Unbelievable. And that's where Thiel said, the man has no risk factor at all. He's intolerant. He's tolerant of all risk. He's a risk taker. So the summer of 2000, what they called the mafia, PayPal mafia, didn't want Elon as the CEO because of his personality and the way he treated people, and they ousted him. And shortly thereafter, in 2002, PayPal went public, and after they were acquired by eBay, and eBay paid $1.5 billion, and Elon's share of that was $250 million. Right? So with that, he finally decided to take a vacation. And on his vacation, he went back to Africa. And after his return from Africa, he didn't feel very well, throwing up a lot, very, very sick, went to the doctor. They told him he had meningitis. So they gave him some drugs for meningitis. He went home, and it didn't improve. He went back into the hospital. They put him in ICU. And the doctor happened to be walking by and looked at his chart, and he said, oh my gosh, he doesn't have meningitis. He has malaria. And he has malaria, which is fatal. And this doctor had treated only 3 cases before, and they all died. So they treated Elon, and he lived, which he said, I will never go back to South Africa again. South Africa, has not been good to me, and it dang near tried to kill me. So after he got back, he took his $250 million that he had gotten, and he decided to start this effort to colonize Mars. He said, number one, he looked at the United States technology advances since landing on the moon, and he said, they've dropped it. The moon landing happened in 1969, and here it is 1994, and we haven't even come close to putting anybody back on another planet. Our space program has dropped. NASA was dropping the Challenger that was delivering astronauts to the space station. And he said, sometimes his thought process is pretty original. He says, our technological progress is not inevitable. Consider the US moon landing in 1969 compared to the Egyptians' pyramids. They built these masterful pyramids, but when they died, the technology never advanced. We never got farther than that. Think of how Rome created all these aqueducts and all this infrastructure during the Roman rule. And when Rome burned and died, all that disappeared. So it's the same thing with our space technology. And he wanted to ensure the survival of human civilization and make sure that human consciousness existed into the future. He said, we live on a fragile planet. And third, the USA is all about adventure. A base on Mars would be an incredible, inspiring thing. Life can't be just about solving problems. It must be about pursuing great dreams. And so that was his great dream. But he realized in order to make this idea viable, he had to move to Los Angeles because that's where Boeing and Lockheed Martin, all the rocket and airline companies, that's where their technology base was. So the critical mass of aerospace engineering was in LA. And so in LA, he moved there and bought this old factory, and he created, in 2002, he created SpaceX. And the idea was, at first, to purchase used rocket missiles, the rocket engines from Russia. Remember, this was during the after the Cold War, and Russia had all these missiles that they were, getting rid of, and so they had all these engines. And so Elon and the eventual head of NASA went to Russia and met with these Russian people, and they got into a dispute over the price of these Russian rockets that came off their missiles. And the Russians thought Elon was an idiot. He was a moron. He had dreams that could never happen. And so every time that Elon said, I'll pay $8 million for each one, they said, no, 21 million. And he said, that's for each. And Elon said, for both? And they said, no, that's each. Embarrassed, they left. But they went back again. And so at some point, Elon said, to heck with this, we're going to build our own rockets. And so the initial attempt to purchase rockets from Russia, because he's stubborn and because he just figures I can build them, we'll learn how to build them. Okay. And in those negotiations, Elon Musk created what he called the Idiot Index, which calculates how much more a finished product was than the cost of its basic material. If a product had a high Idiot Index, its cost could be reduced significantly by devising more efficient manufacturing techniques. If the high Idiot Index, then you can eliminate the cost by better and more efficient manufacturing. And he put that to materials as well. So that's exactly what he did. He started SpaceX in 2002, but they initially decided to not build these great big frontier rockets to get people into orbit, but they built smaller rockets to put smaller payloads into orbit. And SpaceX became creating this thing called Starlink, which is an internet space-based system. That created a huge stream of revenue for people paying for their internet by communications, by space communications. And so once that became successful and they were doing these low orbit space link satellites, that got him going to build bigger rockets, bigger payloads to get people into orbit and eventually get people to Mars. Right? It's an interesting story, all the issues that occurred from the start of SpaceX to where it is today. In 2008, NASA awarded SpaceX a $1.6 billion contract to make 12 flights to the space station. Right? Pretty impressive. The United States government couldn't achieve it. But here's a commercial company whose first 5 launches exploded. was now given a 1.6 billion contract to shuttle astronauts to the space shuttle. So needless to say, he was very successful with SpaceX and still is. So let's talk a little bit about Tesla. He didn't invent the Tesla electric car. That was invented by a guy by the name of Tom Gage, who created a one unit only. It was called T0, and it was a really hot looking sports car, and it was electric. And then along came a couple other guys, Martin Eberhard, Mark Tarpenning, and J.B. Strobel, who Elon funded at the cost of $6.4 million to build a demo roadster. And then he invented another $9 million after they built this next roadster. And they had a horrible conflict of leadership. Elon thought, I'm the guy giving all the money here. I'm the guy, the technology guy helping you build these batteries. I'm the guy that should be getting credit as being the founder and, progenitor of Tesla. Didn't happen that way. And so they outed him. And he tried to bring in other people to run the company, because as a major shareholder, you have some influence. And they were about going bankrupt when they started building the roadsters. If you remember, Governor Schwarzenegger at the time took a ride in the initial, when they introduced it to the public. It was a big PR thing. But now you have to mass produce these things. And Elon had the wisdom to think, we're not going to sell a car that looks like a Prius. We don't want a Prius. We want a roadster. We want something that people will pay $100,000 for. And there were people put down a lot of money once they demoed that initial roadster, including the governor. And you had to put your money down in order to get one coming off the line. They were about to go bankrupt. And then in 2008, Daimler gave them a $50 million stake. And that led to them being able to become more productive. They built what they call these gigafactories. Their latest one is in Austin, Texas, just outside Austin, Texas. They have one in Nevada, they have California, and in Canada. Last year, Tesla net revenue, net profit was $7.9 billion. They created how many? Their biggest competitor actually is a firm that's backed by Warren Buffett. Get that information. They sold 1.8 million units in 2023. They sold 485,000 Teslas in the fourth quarter. And that's 41,000 less than BYD, which is their biggest competitor. It's a Chinese manufacturer. But 90% of BYD sales are in Europe, Japan, and Brazil, and China. They're not in the United States market. Interesting note that Elon Musk was able to convince the Chinese to build his factory in China, not as a partnership with the Chinese government, but solely on their own. That's never happened. That's never happened. So pretty interesting, his influence and his ability as a CEO and leader and a visionary. But he's also controversial. In 2018, he made a tweet about taking Tesla private. The stock dropped it went up 40%. SEC investigated him because he didn't want to be beholden to the SEC, who he doesn't like at all. He did an interview on Joe Rogan's pod, and he was seen smoking weed, a great big reefer. And if you know, when you're a federal contractor, which SpaceX was, you can't be doing that because you have a Drug-Free Workplace Act. And so he became under scrutiny. Now he's drug tested every day, and he says, hey, I don't do drugs. If you can see by the way I smoked that pot with Joe Rogan, I don't know how to smoke pot. So he has also created this gigafactory in Austin, which he sold all of his belongings and houses and personal stuff, and he's moved pretty much to Austin, Texas. Here a week ago, he announced that he is going to create a university in Austin, specifically to address technology, software, code writing. Let's move on, talk a little bit about AI. So I talked about he created this AI, Open AI, which is a nonprofit, to deal with Chat GPT and to deal with Google's darknet, which are AI driven, open, so to speak, open artificial intelligence. But the beauty is, for all that to operate, artificial intelligence to operate, they need data. Elon Musk owns the two biggest banks of data in the world. He owns all the data from Teslas. Every Tesla has video data that responds to how people react to how they're driving the car. That can become a huge windfall for Tesla if they wanted to sell that data to any AI creator. He also now owns Twitter, which there's 500 million posts a day on Twitter. All those posts coming from humans. That's a huge data source that can be used for AI creators. About 2 or 3 years ago, he created this robot called Optimus. They're recreating Optimus. And actually, the newer model isn't like a robot model. It is really a more like humanoid model. And that's all part of Tesla's software and artificial intelligence efforts, because they're trying to use AI to make the Tesla, you don't need a driver. It drives itself. And they're still working on that. So we'll talk a little bit about the Boring Company. That was in 2016. It happened from an idea he had in Hong Kong, and he bought these two $50 million boring machines. Today, they have one tunnel that goes from the airport into downtown Las Vegas, the convention center, I believe. They put that tunnel into effect, but they're using Teslas in the tunnel. He is trying to build a tunnel between Los Angeles and San Francisco, Washington and New York, Philadelphia, with stops in Philadelphia and Boston. Fort Lauderdale has contracted with the Boring Company to put in a tunnel. But these won't be right now pod tunnels. These will be tunnels with cars in them, cars that go really fast in one direction. So where that sits right now, a lot of that is kind of on hold. But to me, it's very, very technology oriented and very interesting. He wants to solve the transportation problems, make them more efficient, make them less harmful to the environment. And he thinks tunnels is one of the ways to do that. His net worth as of today, and I just looked it up, is considered to be $304 billion. I love this because people say, well, in 2019, he didn't pay taxes. He paid 11 million taxes in 18. And in 2021, he paid $11 billion in taxes because he exercised stock options. And he can be witty sometimes. And this is a quote from Senator Elizabeth Warren. It says, "Let's change the rigged tax code so the person of the year will actually pay taxes and stop freeloading off everyone else." Elizabeth Warren tweeted at the end of 2021. Musk shot back, "If you open your eyes for 2 seconds, you would realize I will pay more taxes than any American in history this year. Don't spend it all at once. ... Oh, wait, you already did." So he did buy Twitter. And why did he buy Twitter? He was asked to be a board member. He decided, I just don't want to be a board member. He was going to buy a share, and he said, I just want to buy a share. I want to buy Twitter. So he leveraged his stock holdings with Tesla and SpaceX, and he purchased at a significant $40 billion. He purchased Twitter. And he said, why did he do this? He did it because he believes that it wasn't a platform for free speech anymore. Okay? And he still contends that. It's had many problems with hate speech and all these other things that have occurred once the filters came off Twitter, but he still believes it's a platform and should be a platform for free speech, not censored speech. So we'll have to wait and see where that goes. He fired most of the people that were working there. His leadership style is considered rude and obnoxious. So I have a quote here from when they bought Twitter. Twitter's server frames were housed in a building in Sacramento. Twitter was paying $100 million a year rent for these frames to be housed in Sacramento. And Elon said, that's ridiculous. We're going to move them to Portland. And he said, well, that'll take 8 months. He said, no, we're going to move them this week. If you rent some U-Hauls, we'll get it done. And that was one of his sons on a plane trip to Sacramento saying, Dad, why can't we move them? And so they did. On Christmas Eve, took off on Christmas, and by New Year's, they rented, and the people were aghast that owned the building. They rented the tools. He spent $20,000 in tools at Home Depot to unhook these panel carriers and put them in U-Haul vans and drove them to Portland and installed them. No engineers involved. I mean, not people that really know how to move them, but people that he brought in from SpaceX, people he brought in from his other companies, the Boring Company, that are engineers, and they did it. They moved it. And he had a great line. He said, he told these people that said, oh, it's going to take 6 to 8 months. He said, you got 90 days to move them. Can't make it work, your resignation is accepted. Throughout his business life, that's the way he operates. He expects people to do the impossible, and many times it gets accomplished. Like I said, they rented him, he and his cousins and some engineers, they got all these servers moved. You can imagine the people that were getting $100 million a year for rent, how they felt. Another quote from Elon, and this happened when he was thinking about the Boring Company. He processed his silence from his trance for a couple minutes, and he said, this is how civilization declined. They quit taking risks. And when they quit taking risks, their arteries harden. Every year, there are more referees and fewer doers. That's why America could no longer build things like high-speed rail or rockets that go to the moon. When you've had success for too long, you lose the desire to take risks. Obviously, he's a risk taker. And his latest development is he partnered with John Deere to use his space links to allow farmers to farm digitally, which means riderless tractors that are, autonomous tractors, autonomous fertilizers. And the farmers that he's linked with and talked to, especially from John Deere, said, in the country where we farm, we have very few links to the internet. I get out there, I want to know where my crews are, I want to know where my equipment is. I can't find out because I can't make a connection. Starlink will give me that connection. It will make us hugely more efficient and effective. And the reason why he did it, farming has declined 70% in America, and we currently import more than we export. We import more food product than we export. And so Elon says, this is just a way for me to change that dynamic. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about his personal life. This you can't make up. Believe me. So in 2020, he married Justine Wilson. He actually had some life. Okay. And then in 2002, they had a son, Nevada, who died of infant death syndrome, sudden infant death syndrome in the bed. He was tragically overcome with grief. Right? So he lost his first child, son, to sudden infant death syndrome. In 2004, they had twins, Griffin and Xavier, who later in life, Xavier is transgender, and her name is Jenna, when she was able to officially, the age at which she could 18, change her sex, and was very disengaged from Elon, even though he approves of transgender, even though some of his comments would lead you not to believe that. And then in 2006, let me see, 2006, they had triplets, Kay, Saxon, and Damien, by in vitro fertilization. So he's got 5 kids now with his first wife, Justine. In 2010, they got divorced in 2009. No, 2000. Yeah, married in 2000. And then in 2009, they got a divorce. Right? They're still close. They mutually still raised their 5 children. In 2010, he married a gal by the name of Tallulah Riley, and they were divorced in 2016, and they didn't have any children. But it's interesting, you say, where did he come up with these names? Well, X's. You see X is a very popular thing for him. But Nevada, they named him Nevada because the baby was conceived at the Burning Man Festival in Nevada, in the desert. And then in 2017, after he divorced Tallulah Riley, they wed in 2010, divorced in 2016. He had a really emotionally strong relationship with a gal by the name of Amber Heard. If you know anything about the Johnny Depp trials and suing, that's Amber Heard. And he actually won against her for the damage she did to him, to the millions of dollars in settlement with Johnny Depp. And they had a horrendous relationship. Went on for about 9 months. They'd scream and shout and fight and yell and holler. And everybody around him, for all 3 of these women that he married, they disapproved. They said, this is not going to be good for you. It's not going to be good for you. And so that was a very short-lived relationship. He dated a gal who was an Australian actor by the name of Natasha Bassett, that you've probably seen in many popular movies, for a long time, and still is a very strong, close companion. And then entered a gal by the name of Claire Boucher, and she goes by Grimes. She's a singer, actor, and basically is known as Grimes. And so and that was 2018. And then in 2020, they have a child named X. In 2021, they have a girl. And they name her Y. Well, there was other numbers and things that went with it, but in California, you cannot put numbers on a birth certificate or symbols. It has to be letters. And so that's how they ended up with X and Y. Okay? And so then they had a third, and Y came from a surrogate, because Grimes was a very, very small lady, very thin, had a difficult pregnancy, almost lost the child. And so they decided that when they wanted to have another one, they used a surrogate. And so that's where Y came from. And so they used another surrogate, and they had a boy, and they named him Technomechanicus. I can't make this up, okay? So he's got 10 kids, 10 children. Okay? And he's very close, well, not 10, well, here's the other 2 up here, that in a way are his. He hired a gal by the name of Shivan Zillis, and she was an artificial intelligence creator and investor, and hired her to open AI in 2015, and they became close friends. And it's the only person, all of his people around him will tell you, he's never argued with, never fought with. They have pleasant conversations, and she loves him. She thinks the world of him, and he thinks the world of her. And they work very well together. Never married, never had a relationship. And so at the time, he's having this baby, Technomechanicus. At the same time, she's having babies, and he's the sperm donor from in vitro fertilization. And so she has twins, Strider and Azure. So how old is he now? 49 or 50?
No, you said so.
What? He's born in 71. What?
53.
53. He's born in 71. So he's 53. So you say, why all these kids? That's the other thing that he is another mantra of his. We're not having enough babies. The world needs to be populated. We have declines in birth rates, doesn't lead to better technology, doesn't lead to the world being better. We need to have more babies. So he's constantly trying to tell people that population needs to expand, not contract. And he's a firm believer in that, and he's doing his share. So you can imagine all these other things that are going on in his business life and professional life, and trying to manage all of these personal issues. And one of the things I took away, and this is what started my whole thing, my son is one of these people that was I'm trying to think of the right word. He was very interested in cryptocurrencies, and he became a relay, like the bank for cryptocurrency. You're not an investor, you're not buying, you're not selling. Your computer is storing the cryptocurrency to be transferred, and you get a fee for it. Because he built his own computers, and he just thought this was fascinating. That was going to be the future. And he fell in love with Elon Musk, and that's kind of piqued my interest. I kept talking about Musk. So, and he said, Dad, you know about the algorithm, don't you? You know about the algorithm? I said, no, I don't. So here's the algorithm. And it says, at any given production meeting, whether you're at Tesla or SpaceX, there is a non-trivial chance that Musk will intone like a mantra what he calls the algorithm. It was shaped by the lessons he learned during the production hell surges at the Nevada and Fremont factories of Tesla. His executives sometimes move their lips and mouth the words like they could chant the liturgy along with the priest. I became a broken record on the algorithm, Musk says, but I think it's helpful to say it in an annoying degree. He had 5 commandments. Number 1, question every requirement. Each should come with the name of the person who made it. You should never accept that a requirement came from a department, such as the legal department or the safety department. You need to know the name. Same thing with regulations of the government. He required his people, especially when he was in SpaceX. He would demand that they know who is the person that wrote this regulation in Washington. Don't say, the FAA. I want to know who. I want to know who. Okay? And so you want to know the name of the real person who made that requirement. Then you should question it no matter how smart that person is. Requirements from smart people are the most dangerous because people are less likely to question them. Always do so, even if the requirement came from me. Then make the requirement less dumb. Rule 2, delete any part or process that you can. You may have to add them back later. In fact, you do not end up adding back at least 10% of them, then you didn't delete enough. 3, simplify and optimize. This should come after every step 2. A common mistake is to simplify and optimize a part or a process that should not exist. 4, accelerate cycle time. Every process can be speeded up, but only do this after you have followed the first 3 steps. In the Tesla factory, I mistakenly spent a lot of time accelerating processes that I later realized should have been deleted. 5, automate. That comes last. The big mistake in Nevada and at Fremont is that I began by trying to automate every step. We should have waited until all requirements had been questioned, parts and processes deleted, and the bugs were taken out. So a couple of corollaries is comrades are dangerous. Camaraderie is dangerous. It makes it hard for people to challenge each other's work. There's a tendency to not want to throw a colleague under the bus. That needs to be avoided. All technical managers need to have hands-on experience. For example, managers of software teams must spend at least 20% of their time coding. Solar roof managers must spend time on the roofs doing installations. Otherwise, they're like a cavalry leader who can't ride a horse or a general who can't use a sword. It's okay to be wrong. Just don't be confident in wrong. Never ask your troops to do something you're not willing to do. Whenever there are problems to solve, don't just meet with your managers. Do a skip level where you meet with the level right below your managers. When hiring, look for people with the right attitude. Skills can be taught. Attitude changes require a brain transplant. A maniacal sense of urgency is our operating principle. The only rules are the ones dictated by the laws of physics. Everything else is a recommendation. So that gives you a little bit of a flavor of who Elon Musk is, what he does. He's in the news every day. I can't turn on my New York Times feed without something about Elon Musk. Whether and now he went to Israel and he feels like he's part Jewish. By association. Well, I'm Jewish by association. I'm not anti-Semitic. And the news media loves the guy because he's not private. He's public and he says what he's thinking, whether it's right, wrong, or indifferent. But I believe the guy's a visionary. I believe he's an influencer. He has, would I want to work for him? Probably not. But I do believe that he knows how to get people to accomplish things they thought were impossible based on his experiences with all the companies that he's managed. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the future. And the last thing I want to say is share with you one of his ideas that came off a 60 Minutes interview. He talked about power and electricity. And he says, 100 miles by 100 mile solar panels in orbit can power the United States and never need batteries. The sun is converting 4 million tons of mass energy every second and requires no maintenance. The giant fission reactor is in the sky and we can collect that energy and send it by microwave back to Earth. I mean, he's always thinking beyond where the rest of us are capable of thinking. And if he can think it, sometimes it's going to happen and it's going to work. So I love following what he's doing. I think like other inventors like Steve Jobs of our time that were smarter than I'll ever be, could have a vision of how they can change the world and make society maybe more productive, more efficient, and better. And I think, given all of his quirks and all of his controversy, I think he's really one of those people too. So, any questions? There's a lot of information, sorry. Oh, all kinds of sources. There's a book out today. Oh yeah, where do I get all my information? My sources, I use Wikipedia for sure. All the news feeds, but the biggest one is probably Malcolm Isaacson. In 2023, came out with his biography called Musk. I encourage anybody to read it. It's much more detail about his personal life and all the things going on. And Malcolm was able to follow Elon for 2 years and be with him and just record what was going on and ask him questions. And he's a wonderful biographer and it's fascinating read. It's a long read, it's about 700 pages. But believe me, once you start reading it, you will just buzz through it. Malcolm also did Benjamin Franklin. He did the biography on Steve Jobs. He's an exquisite biographer.
The last name?
Isaacson.
Walter.
Is it Walter? Walter, that's it. Walter Isaacson.
Yes.
Yep. He's a tremendous writer. He's got lots of biographies of famous people that he's done. But this one is his latest, and there's just a lifetime of good stuff in there, and interesting stuff. And, you know, I follow all the leads up, New York Times, Washington Post, and anything else I can get my own, Time Magazine, USA Today even, because they're shorter. But anytime there's something on Musk, I kind of just try to see what it's about. The latest one, this one with John Deere, the partnership with John Deere is really interesting to me, of using Starlink to improve agriculture. So he's always thinking. Any other questions? Well, thank you.